Islamic Dialogue Society and Rumi Forum co-hosted conversation on Muslim and Jewish thinkers who have inspired us. My name is Ibrahim Anli. I am the executive director of Rumi Forum, and we have an ongoing set of partnerships and collaboration with JIDS throughout the year, but we have this nice tradition of branding one event as a co-hosted conversation, a co-hosted program annually. So this is our joint event of 2022. Looking forward to a stimulating conversation with our speakers and our participants this evening. So Muslims and Jews, their negotiation with the modern times has been tough at certain times and eventually very creative at the same time. And 20th century is very representative of these two realities coexisting within each communities. This evening, we are together with 4 speakers who will help us explore the stories of 4 sharp, creative minds, 2 Jewish and 2 Muslim scholars who led and who inspired and who have had continuous impact to this day in the way each of these communities negotiate with the modern age. So I thank everyone once again for joining this exchange, and turn to my friend Dan Spiro. Dan?
Hi, Dan Spiro, president of Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, or JIDS. And I want to first of all say what a great tradition this is to get together with the Rumi Forum every year. We've been doing this for several years, and we hope to continue to do it for a long time. Well, tonight, we are going to respond in a way to those who think that our religions effectively are barnacled or have died some number of centuries ago, and that what anybody has to offer in modern times—
You can lower it just a tad.
And that whatever anybody has to say in modern times is just, kind of immaterial, because the religions are already formed. You're going to hear about 4 very, very interesting minds who will frankly teach us about Islam and Judaism, no matter what our faith is. And we have presenting on these 4 individuals, 4 scholars who are really just fascinating people. So it's really quite an honor for me to be here tonight and to introduce them. We're going to go one at a time in alphabetical order. And I'm going to start with Dr. Marcia Hermansen, who's going to talk about Muhammad Iqbal. Now, Dr. Hermansen is the director of the Islamic World Studies program and professor in the theology department of Loyola University of Chicago. She teaches courses in Islamic studies and the academic study of religion. She received her PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Chicago. And she has authored or co-edited numerous books with extremely fascinating titles. And I'll just give you a few of them, but I feel like I need to read them all. Religious Diversity at School, Educating for New Pluralistic Contexts. Varieties of American Sufism. Islam and Citizenship Education. And last but certainly not least, Muslima Theology, the Voices of Muslim Women Theologians. So, Professor, why don't you teach us about Muhammad Iqbal?
Thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. Salam, shalom, merhaba. So tonight I was requested to speak about Muhammad Iqbal. Muhammad Iqbal definitely qualifies as a modern Muslim figure who left behind a significant legacy. His original writings are in Urdu, Persian, and English, and he's particularly influential among the Muslims of India and Pakistan. Sometimes he's called the intellectual father of Pakistan, although he died in 1938, almost a decade before its establishment. His birthday, November 9th, is a national holiday, and his tomb in Lahore is a place of pilgrimage. Let me do a brief bio. He was born in British India, but that city, Sialkot, is part of Pakistan today. He was born in 1877. He was not from a privileged background. His father was a tailor, and as a child and youth, he had a traditional religious education. Then at university in Lahore, his brilliance was recognized, and he went to Cambridge on a scholarship, and almost simultaneously, he completed his degree at Cambridge, was called to the British bar as a lawyer, and a year later received a PhD from a university in Munich, and his thesis, written in English, was later published as The Development of Metaphysics in Persia. It's a study of pre-modern Sufi philosophers. He returned to Lahore, and there his career, he didn't practice too much law. He was mainly a poet and a philosopher. Today we'd probably call him a public intellectual. He was involved in dialogue and correspondence and activism across a range of spheres, political, cultural, religious circles. So how is Iqbal inspiring? I welcome the opportunity to consider Iqbal in this session. Initially, I had some trepidation that perhaps his influence and his reputation was limited to South Asia. And also, since about 100 years have passed since the time of his most important work, would he be considered less relevant to contemporary issues? The struggle of Iqbal to find an authentic, inspiring, and meaningful way to become actualized as a modern self, while remaining grounded in, committed to, and passionate about religious tradition, however, is not a project whose relevance has passed. So I got to kind of quickly look around at the works that have come out about Muhammad Iqbal recently, and I found his admirers and influence in multiple and diverse strains of thought, not only among Muslims from around the world, but also engaged by thinkers such as the philosopher Charles Taylor, who wrote, and here I'm quoting Charles Taylor, "We, the West, have much to learn from Iqbal in search of a renewed self." During his lifetime, Iqbal was highly engaged and interested in contemporary Western thought. Kant, Marx, Bergson, and many others, as well as by classical and more recent trends in Islamic activism and thought. It's remarkable that while his message reached a mass audience through the medium of poetry, being really the way to connect with people and inspire them and move them in many parts of the Muslim world. So that poetry is in Urdu and Persian. However, he also wrote learned and articulate reflections and critical analysis in English. One of his famous books is The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. One gets the sense that Iqbal is on the boundary of things between East and West, traditional and modern, personal identity and fulfillment, between Islamic loyalty and world humanism, between activism and mysticism, between poetry and philosophy. I'd like to thank our host tonight, the Dialogue Society, and the Rumi Forum. Iqbal, I need to give a shout out. Iqbal was particularly inspired by Rumi, whom he called a murshid, a spiritual guide. Iqbal wrote, in just one play, wrote about Rumi a lot, but he wrote in English in the Reconstruction, quote, "The world of today needs a Rumi to create an attitude of hope and kindle the fire of enthusiasm for life." So the time is short. I'm going to give quick, time permitting, 3 examples from the thought of Iqbal. So one famous element in his thought is what's called khudi, the self. In the modern self, he's moving, the self used to be something about selfish and ego. No, this is a positive personhood. And one of the most famous couplets of Iqbal, who I know we have some Urdu speakers here, so you can, recite along with me the khudi, the one. Khudi ko kar buland itna ki har taqdeer se pehle, khuda bande se khud puche, bata teri raza kya hai. So take your personhood to such a high level that before every fated action that you take, God will ask of you, state, what is it that will fulfill you? So you can see this, bursting in individuality, humanism, make yourself, almost a kind of existentialism. Now, to prove that this is not, shall we say, dated or I don't know what dated might be considered, but I can tell you that there's a popular Pakistani rock song by the band Junoon, where they sing this, to a rock beat. So, it still has a, shall we say, a youth appeal. And in the spirit of dialogue, I'd like to put this in conversation with the Hasidic story of Rabbi Zusya, who says, when I get to heaven, I will not be asked, why were you not Moses? They will ask, why weren't you Zusya? Why didn't you live up to your own potential? So it's about the human potential. Example number 2 is another poem. I'm only going to read the English translation. The prophet's night journey has taught me that heaven lies within the bounds of human reach. This universe perhaps is yet incomplete, for I hear repeated sounds of be and it was. So be and it was, kun fayakun is the phrase, it's Quranic, it refers to God, Allah creating the universe. All God has to do is say be and everything becomes. But you see in this couplet, it's relating the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the potential of human experience. So there's both simultaneously the creation out of nothing, but there's a kind of every instant the universe is recreated and the human being is participating in that, which reminds me of the Jewish mystical idea of tikkun olam, the human being participating in the creation or the repair of the world. The third and the shortest example is a quote from the reconstruction of Islam that Iqbal is quoting the Qur'an, translating the Quranic verse as in the voice of God, we have created you all from one breath of life. And this is a very unique translation of the Quranic verse. It's often translated, we have created you from a single soul. So it's the unity of all humanity. But I would say that idea of the one breath of life is very typical of his thought, his idea of this enthusiasm, this inspiration of the breath, because after all, the word inspire comes from the idea of the breath. So in conclusion, I'm inspired by Iqbal's multiple representations of how the spiritual or mystical element that is shared within us and is within faith, how it flows through all of us as individuals and can lead to positive transformation, not only personally, but collectively. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. So again, we're just going to go one at a time to hear about these great figures, and then we're going to turn it over to all of you to ask questions or make statements. So the next figure we will hear about is Rami Shapiro. And Rami will be discussed by Herb Levy. Herb was raised in an Orthodox home in Baltimore. He completed the high school department of the then Baltimore Hebrew College in addition to public high school. Now, through his college years, Herb became disconnected from the Judaism that he was raised in, but began to reconstruct Judaism, we just heard that word, reconstruct, to address the social change commitment he made in his life. He spent over 40 years working in affordable housing as a contribution to Tikkun Olam. He's been active in the Kol Hami Reconstructionist congregation in Arlington, Virginia, since its birth at the end of 2000, the year 2000. And during that time, he's led more than 200 services. He's been active in the steering and ritual committees. He's served as the congregation's director. He's drafted a Machzor and the Haggadah that he used to lead 18 Kol Hami second Seders. He also brings folk music to the DMV. And I've enjoyed plenty of musicians that Herb has brought to the city over the years. But most importantly, he's the treasurer of JIDS. And he has been serving us throughout this pandemic by hosting the 20 or so Zoom events that we've sponsored. So all of us who've been enjoying these events have Herb to thank. And now we will hear about Rami Shapiro.
Good evening, thanks. I want to start off my talk with just taking a second so you can get a peek at what Rami looks like. This is Rami Shapiro. So, and I'll leave it up for a second while I just say a few things about him. He's an award-winning author of over 36 books on religion and spirituality. He's received rabbinical ordination from the Hebrew Union College and holds a PhD in religion from the Union Graduate School. He was a rabbinic chaplain with the Air Force for 3 years, a congregation rabbi for 20 years, and a professor of religious studies for 10 years. Presently, he's the contributing editor at Spirituality and Health magazine. He writes a column called Roadside Assistance for the Spiritual Traveler. He that's for their print edition, writes a column for their digital edition called Spirituality and hosts the magazine's bi-weekly podcast, Spirituality and Health with Rabbi Romney. While he was ordained by the Reform movement, Rabbi Romney's influence has been felt across most of the denominations of Judaism. He can be described as an independent rabbi, a Jewish humanist rabbi, a Jewish renewal rabbi, a reconstructionist rabbi, a reform rabbi, a conservative rabbi, and a heretic. Core to Rabbi Romney's approach to Judaism is his conviction that religions are like languages. No language is true or false. All languages are of human origin. Each language reflects and shapes the civilization that speaks it. There are things you can say in one language that you cannot say or say as well in another. And the more languages you speak, the more nuanced your understanding of life becomes. His writings reflect this multilingual approach to Judaism, an approach that increasingly reflects the reality of being a North American Jew, that is, of a person with a commitment to Judaism who's been exposed to and espouses spiritual beliefs that are broader than those of Orthodox Judaism. Now, Dan mentioned a bit of my background, and I'm going to come out of the share and just mention that my family background in Orthodoxy is strong. My family came from the Kurlander area near Riga in Latvia. My grandfather moved to Baltimore because of the Ner Israel Rabbinical Seminary, which is one of the prime Orthodox seminaries in the United States. His grandparents took in yeshiva students as a way to supplement their meager living. And one of their yeshiva students was a fellow by the name of Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who became the first chief rabbi of Palestine, then Palestine. My own background, I was Orthodox in my early years, the first 16 years of my life, but increasingly found that it was constraining to what my experience of life was. And there was a time I left Judaism, and then there was a time that I found my way back thanks to a book called The Freedom Seder by Rabbi Arthur Waskow. And I discovered that the Seders that I used to be a part of, which were very strict in their format, there's a requirement that you must eat before midnight, and we barely did each year. Not the place that a kid can feel the most comfortable. That there was this whole other thing going on in Judaism, and that it permitted me, that book permitted me to widen my view of Judaism and began to reconstruct it. And lo and behold, I became a reconstructionist eventually. My own path, however, is more of a Jewish renewal path than a reconstructionist one. And those are differences that are probably for another conversation. But I would say that my direct experience with Rabbi Rami is limited. I attended a Jewish meditation workshop that he led with another Jew named Richard Alpert, who you may know better as Ramdas. The workshop was in New York City. It was at an auspicious time, 7 days after September 11th, 2001. And Rabbi Romney impressed me for many reasons, but one of the strongest reasons was he was able to stay so centered in his teachings and his speaking that sense of centeredness exuded out from him and covered us with a blanket of safety. What I've gained from Rabbi Rami comes principally from his writing that I find both stimulating and consistent with my own pantheistic orientation. Put simply, everything is God. This universe was born from a singularity, and that has never stopped being a singularity. It is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, always becoming. It is infinite being. It is Yud-He Vav-He, the sound of breath. If one tried to pronounce the Hebrew letters that make up Yud-He Vav-He, we would be hearing the sound of breath, so that every time we breathe, we are saying the name of God. But that oneness of being is broader than anyone's individual view of what religion or what God is. It is common for people to believe that they have found a unique and absolutely correct path to the one. But there is, in my view and in Rabbi Rami's view, wisdom in every faith. I refuse to draw a bright yellow line that says that only one practice of Judaism, only one practice of religion is the only way to be in line with the teachings of the Tanakh, of the Talmud, and of the Tanya. Back to Rabbi Rami. Rabbi Rami's approach to perennial wisdom spoke to my core. As Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi once said, Rabbi Rami is a Jewish practitioner of perennial wisdom, the fourfold truth at the mystic heart of all religion. All life is a manifesting of the dynamic, non-dual aliveness called by many names: Tao, Mother, Brahman, God, Allah, Yud-He Vav-He, nature, and every one of your names as well. We humans have the innate capacity to awaken in, with, and as this aliveness. Awakening to aliveness calls us to the golden rule and being a blessing to all the families of the earth, human and otherwise. Awakening in, with, and as aliveness and living the golden rule in service to being a blessing is our highest calling as human beings. Rabbi Romney has written 3 separate books on this topic: Perennial Wisdom for the Spiritually Independent, The World Wisdom Bible, and Tanya, the masterpiece of historic wisdom. He wrote the book Beginnings with Pastor Michael Smith, a Baptist minister from Tennessee. Beginnings is a delightful conversation about the book of Bereshit, Genesis, from both a Jewish and a Baptist Christian perspective. Here's a quote from Rabbi Romney. Death is not a punishment, nor does it lead to punishment. Reward and punishment after death assumes that there is a you that survives the return. There is simply your egoic self, insisting that it cannot die, even if eternal life means eternal torment. But such thinking is in error. There is no you separate from the one, just as there is no wave separate from the ocean. When you die, you are still what you were and are, God. The Judaism that Rabbi Romney teaches rests on 2 pillars: teshuvah, returning you to your true nature as a manifesting of aliveness, and tikkun, repairing the world through Rabbi Hillel's golden rule: what is hateful to you, do not do to another. The Judaism he teaches is free from chosenness, xenophobia, and ethno-nationalism. The Judaism he teaches envisions a fearless world without war, where people eat simply, drink moderately, work joyously, and love freely. The Judaism he teaches affirms machlochet l'shem shamayim and ilu ve'ilu, honoring argument, doubt, and critical thinking over intellectual passivity, spiritual conformity, and manufactured consent. He's written 3 books on this subject, including the book Minyan and the book Open Secrets. One of the ways that people may come in contact with Rabbi Romney is through his poetry. Many of his poems have become prayers, and they've become a part of the Reconstructionist Sidurim, as well as the Reconstructionist Machzor, and many other places as well. The poem Conduit to God. Sing and awake. Sing the never before sung. Sing a new song to God, from God, as God. I still my mind and calm my heart. I soften my breath and fill my belly with air. I hold that fullness in tension to be released only when the Spirit moves. My breath is transformed from silence to sound, from mystery to music, and back to mystery again. For breath is the conduit to God, and song the sound of breath in love. Rabbi Romney experiences aliveness as Chokhmah, Sophia, Mother Wisdom, through whom all reality is birthed and guided. She speaks to us through dream and parable, myth and mysticism, and the wisdom sages of every tradition, both spiritual and scientific. While he studies her teachings in many traditions, he's written about her and shares her teachings within the frame of Jewish wisdom literature. He's written 7 books on Chokhmah and her wisdom, including the Divine Feminine and Biblical Wisdom literature and the Tao of Solomon. Rabbi Romney describes himself as a food addict and a compulsive overeater, and there I can also identify. He's been clean for many years, but still says he can't be certain about tomorrow. While he's aware of the limitations of and criticism leveled at 12-step recovery, nonetheless, he finds the 12 steps insightful and life-saving, not only for those struggling with maimed addictions, but for all of us who wrestle with the universal addiction Bill W. called playing God, a disease that keeps us from realizing that it is God who is playing us. He's written 2 books about the 12 steps. Final thing I'm going to mention is Rabbi Romney's writing. Writing is the art of translating thought into sound, sound into words, and words into print. As Richard Gwindon, the creator of the comic strip Gwindon, says, writing is nature's way of showing us how sloppy our thinking is. Rabbi Rami says that writing is what he does. It's how he thinks. It's how he makes sense and meaning out of the world. It's how he relates to people. He says he doesn't have students or followers. He has readers and critics. My favorite book of his writing is Accidental Grace, which is a collection of his poems and his translation of prayers and songs. Many of his translations have found their way, as I said, into Reconstructionist liturgy. And finally, one of the things that I absolutely love about Rabbi Romney is he's got a sense of humor, or at least one that's like mine, so therefore it's a great one. This is Rabbi Romney's perspective of himself. He sits at the intersection of tohu vavohu, of the null and the void, in a booth that was once occupied by Lucy of Peanuts fame. Spiritual help for 5 cents. The rabbi is in. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. And I hope as people listen to these presentations that stand on their own, they start to think about, maybe some commonalities that you're hearing among, these people that we're hearing about tonight. So our next speaker is going to talk about Saeed Nursey. And our speaker is, maybe I mentioned maybe the most important thing for this event tonight for everybody but me. He's the founder of the Rumi Forum, not just in Washington, D.C., but the Rumi Forum. I say that's the most important thing for everybody but me, because for me, he's a professor at John Carroll University. And I'm a longtime fan of the football team, the Raiders, that has been completely taken over by this university. The coach, the general manager, it's all I hear about is John Carroll University. So it's a thrill to have you here tonight from John Carroll. The doctor is the Saeed Nursey Chair in Islamic Studies and a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He holds a PhD in Islamic Theology from the University of Marmara in Turkey, after completing his dissertation on the personification of evil in the Islamic tradition. The professor has written over 30 academic articles and encyclopedia entries on topics in Islam. He is the editor and translator of Fundamentals of Rumi's Thought, a Mevlevi Sufi Perspective, and the editor and a critical edition of Al-Sakaraksi, Sifat Ashrat al-Sa'a. His most recent books are Islam's Jesus and Islamic Spirituality, Theology and Practice for the Modern World. And he's currently working on a book on Islamic eschatology. So now we're going to hear about Saeed Nursey.
Thank you, Dan, for this generous introduction. So I think it's important to mention Saeed Nursey correctly, and then did say correctly, but sometimes when we Google it, it comes Saeed Nursey, and generally it comes Saeed Nursing. It has nothing to do with nursing. Nursi is the title of his village, the village that he's from. So when you Google it, Saeed is not said. It is Saeed and Nursi, and not nursing. So briefly about his bio, if I will really have a brief introduction about his bio, because he is so prolific author and so prominent figure, and I think I thought it would be a miracle to squeeze his life in 12 minutes, but we'll do our best to introduce him. So when we say Bediüz Zaman Saeed Nursey, his title is Bediüz Zaman. Bediüz Zaman literally means the unique of the century, or the unique of the age, or peerless of the age. He was born in 1876 in Eastern Anatolia to a family who was known from their piety. His mother was known as Nuriye, and his father was known Mirza the Pious. In Eastern Anatolia, in an area called Bitlis, the city of Bitlis. So he died in March 23rd, 1960, which coincides with the Islamic calendar of Ramadan 25th, 1379 after Hijrah. So he died in Ramadan, and it's believed that it was the night of power, Laylatul Qadr. As I said, he started his education in the local areas, in the local schools, madrasas, the schools of the Ottoman Empire of the time. And then he started to write. So his writings are divided into two periods, basically. He himself divided his life into two periods. One, he called it Old Saeed, and the other one, he called it New Saeed. So Old Saeed would be from 1876, from his birth, if you can put that way, until 1924. And New Saeed starts from 1924, perhaps until his death, 1960. So his major works, his major books that he wrote, basically they are totally known as the treatises of light, Rasail al-Nur, the treatises of light. He divided them into several sections in general. One section is called Truth of Faith. He speaks about faith, the importance of faith. And then another section is called Defenses, because he was taken to the court and he would defend himself. And another section was called Appendices, that he would send letters to his students. And that is, another aspect of his works. So the major works, I would say, that he wrote, they are known as four major books. The Words, which is known in Turkish as Sözler. By the way, he wrote all his works in Turkish, some of them in Arabic, a few poems in Persian language, in Farsi. But these major ones are all in Turkish. The Words, Mektubat, the letters, Lemalar, the flashes, and Shu'alar, the rays. So these are major works of Nursi. Approximately, it is known as about 130 treatises on Islamic subjects. And that's why I said he's a prolific author. In these books, Nursi answered hundreds of questions and elaborated on themes such as theology, Sufism, reconciliation between science and religion. He advocated for this reconciliation. He praised modern sciences, interestingly. He focused on some aspect of Islamic law, questions about his personal life. He answered those questions, like why he did not marry, why he did not grow a beard, something like that. He would answer those questions. And many other social issues related to the situations of his time. So some of his books are, if you search, you will find it as a pocket books. They are actually taken from his major works. The uniqueness, to me, the uniqueness of Nursi is known maybe through his interpretation of some verses of the Qur'an. His interpretation is called tafsir, which known as commentary of the Qur'an, but he called it manawi tafsir, spiritual commentary, not traditional tafsir that is going verse by verse, but he focuses on the verses that he thinks that will be the most important for his audience, for his time. And one aspect of Nursi during these interpretations, he speaks of the stories of the prophets as an inspiration for modern scientific developments. For example, the story of Solomon in the Qur'an, the story of Moses in the Qur'an, the story of David in the Qur'an. He gives all these stories as, in fact, inspirations for the development of modern sciences, modern technology. And he gives examples like TV, the idea of TV to having transmission of pictures. He gives this as a reference to the story of Solomon. It's a long story, but I will not get into that. You can read on your own when you are available. So, and then in his time, there were tensions. As we know, this time, in the time of really catastrophes, like the First World War, and then later the Second World War. So he would focus on the importance of knowledge. He would say the most dangerous enemy is ignorance and poverty. And he would say we should fight ignorance with knowledge and poverty with art. We should develop in these areas. And that is how Muslims will develop. That's what he suggested for the Islamic society. One aspect of him, I think I wrote an article on this aspect of Nursi, and that is nonviolence. He preferred to avoid the reactionary attitude that characterized the nature of Islamic activism in his days. People were very much reactionary in his days. Even sometimes they would criticize him. But Nursi would say, no, the most important thing in this century and in the future is non-violence. Why he was so concerned about this? Because he thought that violence would violate the rights of innocence, will be transgression on the rights of innocence, especially children, women who have nothing to do with those political conflicts. He called his disciples as volunteer civil servants of safety. The Turkish word for it is asayish memurları. Asayish is Turkish person, also in Farsi, I think it is used in the same word, which means the servants of safety, volunteer civil servants of safety. He conceptualized his idea of nonviolent activism with the term musbet hareket, which means positive action. Always do positive actions. That's what he would suggest to his students. It is very interesting. He has last letter to his students, like the last advice, what he would say to his students, and that's known his last letter. He says, dear brothers, our duty is to do positive action and not negative action. It is to serve faith in accordance with what pleases God. We should not interfere with the duty of God. We must respond to all the difficulties we face during our service to faith with patience and thankfulness. Such a service will protect society from disorder. That was his major idea, especially towards the end of his life, that he was afraid that something can happen and that could lead to disorder in society, that could lead to anarchy in society. And he would say, we have to be servants of order, servants of safety for the community. And another aspect of Nursi is dialogue. He never focused on the differences between Muslims and the people of the book. Yes, there are differences, and there are known differences. But he would say, let's focus on the mutual benefits of dialogue and cooperation. between the people of the book, especially he's emphasizing dialogue with the people of the book, that is Christians and Jews. Muslims would advocate for that. In his later books and his earlier books, he would say, this dialogue will bring peace to the world. And he speaks of a common ground between Muslims and Christians and Jews. They have many common themes, Nursi would say. What will be like the common themes? He wrote a book called Ukhuwat Risalasi, the Treatise of Brotherhood. And he asks people to share their ideas, to focus on their shared values. What can be the shared values? Even sharing the same city, he says, is a shared value. We are from the same city. Sharing the same country, sharing the same world, being in the realm of humanity is a shared value, Nursi would say. And therefore, when he would say, what's the most important shared value? He would say, for the people of the book, we all believe in the same God as the most important tie between believers. We believe in the same God, the creator of heavens and earth. And finally, I like to finish with a statement from him. And that's one of his core principles, to love, love, and hate, hatred. He says, it is time to end hatred and animosity. The two world wars have shown how ugly animosity is and how it can be destructive and wrong. It has been proved that there is no benefit coming from hatred. That is the quote from Nursi. And as you know, the two world wars destroyed almost the entire humanity. Millions of people were killed. And Nursi says this has to teach us something, that no longer hatred should be allowed. There should be an end for hatred and animosity. And then love. If you love, love will increase. If you hate hatred, hatred will decrease. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so before we turn this over to you, we have one more presentation. And this one is going to be about Menachem Mendel Schneerson, otherwise known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And our speaker tonight is Rabbi Lee Weissman. Now, Rabbi Weissman was a Jewish educator in California for over a quarter of a century, though we are lucky to have him again in the Washington, D.C. area. For over 10 years, he has been an interfaith activist, both online and in person. His Facebook forum is called Abraham's Tent, and it offers a place for Muslims and Jews to communicate with one another on religious issues. His Twitter account has a name that is unforgettable, Jihadi Jew, and it has a wide interfaith following, reflecting the fact that, as many of you know, the words jihad and Israel are actually synonyms. Rabbi Weissman's personal passion is Hasidic philosophy, particularly the teachings of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. And he currently attends the Magen David Sephardic congregation in what is now known as North Bethesda, but as a resident of Bethesda since 1962, I'll call it Rockville, which is what we always used to call it. So it's great to have you again, Lee, and please talk about Menachem Mendel Schneerson.
My pleasure. Shalom Aleichem and Assalamu Alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I want to preface this by saying, while I would identify myself as a Chassid, as a follower of the Hasidic movement, I do not see myself as a Lubavitcher, as a follower of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, nor did I know the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So I preface that, and I'm going to begin with a little bit of history I'm going to refer to him as the Rebbe, and I'll explain a little bit later why that is. So the Rebbe, as he is known, was born in Ukraine in 1902 in the family of the Chabad line of Hasidic spiritual leaders. As one might expect, he was an avid and talented student of Jewish mystical philosophy and Jewish law. As you might not expect, he also attended university in Berlin and later in the Sorbonne in Paris. There's a beautiful story about him studying Jewish mystical philosophy while sitting in the philosophy course of Martin Heidegger. He was an interesting character before becoming the Rebbe in 1950, and reluctantly he became the Rebbe after his father-in-law, who was the Rebbe before him, passed away. He was actually an engineer in the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So he's kind of uniquely positioned, if you can imagine, between as somebody who has a deep Jewish education and also a secular education, as somebody who can kind of be a bridge those two worlds. And I have the advantage of having heard everybody else. I say a little bit like, Saeed Nursey also knew about the modern world, knew about science, in the same way the Rebbe was able to kind of talk about science in his teachings and so forth. Now, the title Rebbe is given to any Hasidic spiritual leader, and certainly there are lots and lots of Rebbes. There are lots and lots of spiritual leaders of Hasidic sects, similar to maybe a Sufi sheikh, to a tariqah for the Sufis. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe was unique, I think, in seeing himself really as what he called, and other people called, Manhi Gador, as being the leader of the generation. And his view expanded beyond his small group of followers to include the entirety of the Jewish people, observant and non-observant. And he had an influence that really extended to almost every area of the Jewish world. You know, one of the few things that Ariel Sharon, Elie Wiesel, and Bob Dylan probably have in common is that they all had encounters with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And we've already seen his influence, actually. Rami Shapiro, who Herb Levy talked about earlier, studied for a while in a Chabad yeshiva. His teacher, Reb Zalman Schachter Shlomi, who was very influential in the Jewish renewal movement that Herb is interested in, was a very close student of Lubavitcher Rebbe and a friend of Lubavitcher Rebbe, and was at one point one of his messengers, one of his representatives. So his influence really hit every area of the Jewish world. He was a unique figure in the sense that he took a mystical philosophy and transformed it into a kind of activist movement. And in this sense, I again have the advantage of having heard a little bit like Saeed Nursey again, right? In this idea of taking something which might be kind of a mystical philosophy and transforming it into an activism. Like all Hasidim, Chabad Hasidim believes that the world consists of two dimensions, a physical dimension and a spiritual dimension. And that by using the world in the ways that are commanded by God, the spiritual dimension of things is enhanced and revealed. So, and at the same time, and very importantly, that every human being has a soul, a divine godly soul, and that's absolutely incorruptible. Now, if we take those two features, the Rebbe deploys that philosophy to send his followers out, that is to break the normal insularity of Hasidic communities, to send his followers out and to encourage people to be engaging in the commandments, engaging in Jewish life with the idea of revealing more and more of God's light into the world, right? The idea and more into their own lives. And at the same time, recognizing the preciousness of their souls. So while other Hasidic groups kind of looked at the outside world and said, okay, there's nothing there. He took this philosophy and said, okay, we're going to go and we're going to reveal the godliness that's hidden even in the furthest places, even in places far away from conventional Jewish religiosity. So while other American Jewish leaders were talking about demographics and Jewish identity, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was very, very focused on Jewish practice, on getting people to engage in Jewish life. As Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, who was the former British chief rabbi, said, if the Nazis searched out every Jew in hate, the Rebbe wished to search out every Jew in love. And so he sent out emissaries to all different, many parts of the world, every place from Kathmandu to Uzbekistan to Morocco to Iran, to assist Jewish communities in their observance. At the heart of his leadership, though, was the personal encounter. The Rebbe would spend hours and hours every day answering letters or meeting people individually, often until 3 o'clock in the morning. And many people talk about the experience of having the Rebbe's piercing blue eyes, looking at them, and the ability that he had to get to the heart of a problem, or to see an angle to a problem that nobody else had seen, and his ability to speak on every topic you could imagine. He was able to talk about politics, talk about science, talk about religion. He was really able to talk about a lot of things. And he was really revered. I mean, to the extent that during his lifetime, and now even after he's passed away in 1994, that people believe that he was the Messiah, and some people still believe that he is the Messiah. As someone once observed, the Rebbe did not want to make followers; he wanted to make leaders. He gave people a lot of empowerment, and even when people would come to him for all sorts of advice in every possible area of life, everything including medical decisions, business decisions, spiritual decisions, he would sometimes be very directive, but he would also try to empower them to acknowledge their personal dignity, and to tell them that they could choose what is best for themselves. The Rebbe produced a huge amount of scholarly work in the form of discourses. Those discourses were primarily in Yiddish, but they were translated immediately into Hebrew and to English. So there are, if you look on the internet, you'll find thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of the talks of the Rebbe, built on the mystical philosophy of Chabad, of the Hasidic movement, but always punctuated by some kind of a call for action. Campaigns to bring the masses to more observance, or campaigns to bring his more hardcore followers to deepen their Torah learning. One campaign to teach the Noahide laws, the universal religion of ethical monotheism to the rest of the world. These campaigns were always a part of his program. Since his death in 1994, no Rebbe has been appointed to. He is the seventh in his line of Rebbes. No Rebbe has been appointed to replace him, and none is expected. Chabad is now leaderless, but that is his organization. It's grown to 4,000 couples in over 1,000 communities, 48 states, over 80 countries. Almost every college in America, for example, has a Chabad presence on campus. And Chabad claims now that based on their number of participants, that they are now the single largest Jewish denomination in America. So it's very hard for anybody, I think it's certainly in America, but I would say almost anywhere in the world, to say that they have been impacted by the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe or by his activism. I want to end with a quote from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that I thought was beautiful and speaks to the mission, I think, of JIDS. He says, "Intolerance lies at the core of evil. not the intolerance that results from any threat or danger, but the intolerance of another being who dares to exist, intolerance without cause. It is so deep within us because every human being secretly desires the entire universe to himself. Our only way out is to learn compassion without cause, to care for each other simply because that other exists. And really at the core of the Rebbe's philosophy was the concept of bitul hayesh, or the nullification of the ego. And really without that nullification of the ego, it's not possible for us to have a world in which we not only tolerate the existence of others, but we welcome the existence of others. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we turn it over to everybody, I'm going to take a concept that you raised to plug the next JIDS meeting. So you just heard about how the Lubavitcher Rebbe addressed the entire world's community of Jews, not observant Jews only, or not, Reform Jews only, all of the world's Jews. On Tuesday, March 15th, from 7 to 9, Rabbi Sonny Schnitzer and the Muslim scholar Safi Kaskas are going to talk about these concepts of the world's community of Jews, the world's community of Muslims. What does it mean? What is the relevance of that? What are the implications on Zionism? What are the implications on how we deal with the Uyghurs? So it's, this will continue to further, what we're discussing tonight. And I very much hope that you all can join us then. So now we're entering the next phase of tonight's program. We are going to, before I ask any questions of the panelists, we want to hear your voices, but we've heard 4 panelists tonight. So often when we hear 2 panelists, we say, you guys go on and on and on. You can talk for a couple of minutes. It's okay if you don't have a question, if you want to make a statement, but we want your statements to be short because we want to hear a lot of voices. And, if you have a question, that's fine too. And if you want to be recognized, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's something that says reactions, and you can raise your hand. You can hit the raise hand, and then I can see that your hand is up. But please, after you finish, hit lower hand, so we'll know that you don't have a second question. So I don't see any. Okay, I see Sabia. I see you first. So please. You're muted, I think.
She's not, but we still can't hear her.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Okay. Yeah, my question is for Professor Zaki. You mentioned that the Prophet's stories are an inspiration for science and technology and cited Prophet Solomon as an example. Could you elaborate on that? I'm intrigued by how that became an inspiration for science and technology.
Thank you very much, Sabiha. This story is in the Qur'an, and Nursi interprets this Quranic verse that Solomon is, of course, presenting the true religion of God in the Islamic teaching. Islam with lowercase I of the time. Islam was the religion of Solomon with lowercase I, as I said. There was a queen, known in the tradition as Queen of Sheba. She had a throne, and Solomon knew the language of birds. One of the birds, woodpecker, is absent in the meeting of Solomon. And Solomon says, where is this bird? I'm going to punish it. And the bird comes and says, Solomon, I visited a place. There is a lady who is very powerful, but somehow they do not worship the creator of heaven and earth. They worship the sun. And Solomon says, I will send a letter to them. and they have to believe in the creator of heaven and earth and not the sun. So the bird takes the letter of Solomon to this land. And it's believed that Solomon was in the area of maybe Damascus, known as Damascus today, and the Queen of Sheba was in Yemen. We don't know exactly the location, but that's how it's described in the Muslim commentaries. So she looks at the letter that's in the Qur'an, as you might, for those who are familiar with the Qur'an, innahu min Sulaymana wa innahu bismillahir rahmanir rahim. The only verse that Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is not in the beginning of chapter is that verse. Solomon says, it is from Solomon, Sulaiman, peace be upon him, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and invites this queen to believe in one God. Then queen sends some gifts to Solomon, and queen thinks that if this is a king, after we send him some gifts, he will be satisfied and he will not ask us anything more. And Solomon responds and says, I'm not asking for your gifts. I'm asking that you believe in one God, not worshiping the sun. And then she says, I'm going to visit Solomon. So based on Solomon's invitation, she starts coming. So Solomon, that is the core of the story, the related aspect. Bring his knowledgeable people, and he says, I like her throne to be here in my palace momentarily. Who can do that? This is in the Quran, actually. And the one who has knowledge, the Quran says, indahu ilm, he had knowledge, says, I will bring her throne in the moment that you sit and you stand up, like so in so short period of time. Solomon doesn't like it. The other one says, I will bring her throne here in the twinkling of an eye. And Solomon likes that. And he brings the throne in twinkling of an eye, and she comes. And Solomon says, is this look like your throne? And she says, it is exactly my throne. And then when she realized, she says, Aslamtu li Sulaymane wa li Rabbil Alameen. I couldn't remember the exact verse, but the meaning of it, I have submitted myself to the Lord of Solomon, to the Lord of Solomon, the God of Solomon. So she became submitting herself to God, and she became worshiping the God of Solomon. The story here is that how these two knowledgeable people, we have their names actually even in the commentaries. One of them, I think, is called Asaf, the one who brought in the twinkling of an eye, is like a vizier and like advisor of Solomon. And the comment, Nursi says, since the Quran teaches that this was possible to bring the matter itself in such short period of time, modern science can actually work for this. So this is an inspiration. This is showing the highest level of transmission of the things, which is the transmission of material things. So in a very short period of time, technically, scientifically, you should be able to transmit materials from one location to another location. First of all, he says, it was not only the material things, but the voices of the people around the throne were heard. The picture. So now, as humanity, we have managed to have the pictures and the voices, the transmission of pictures and the voices, but not the transmission of materials, the matter. Is it possible? I asked one of my colleagues who is a scientist, he said, it is possible, but when you arrive to the other side, you will become like a piece of potatoes. You know, you will not remain as a human being. You will be totally smashed. But it is possible, still it is possible to transmit materials. The Quran gives the highest point. O human beings, that's what Nursi says. O human beings, one of my servants who submitted his will to my will, that is Solomon, and I gave him this opportunity to do this. Now you work very hard, use the arts that I have created, the laws of nature that I have created, and reach to that level and make your world as a place of justice, as Solomon was using this for the sense of justice.
Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat box, and Maggie Johnson had a question for all four speakers. And it was to talk about how these individuals have most impacted the world in either their time or our time. So we could probably spend 4 hours or maybe 10 hours with you guys answering that question. So let me see if I can tell you what I'd like you to do. So we just heard from Rabbi Lee that the Chabad movement is the largest single denomination in America, they claim. And of course, that was largely inspired by Lubavitcher Rebbe. That is a succinct answer, and I'd like to hear maybe a couple for each of these people so that we can move on to the next question. But it's a fascinating question, so I'd like to hear from each of you. Why don't we start you want to start in reverse order this time? So let's go with Rabbi Lee. If you can come up with, I just mentioned one, if you can come up with another one. And you're muted. I'm
mute. I think another one would be that he made it, the Lubavitcher Rebbe made it okay to be publicly religious, publicly Jewish religious. He made Jewish religiosity way more public and visible.
Thank you. So let's go to Dr. Sarita Prak again. A couple of ways in which Saeed Nursey had impacted either his time or ours.
Can you repeat the question again, Don?
Yes, a couple of ways, succinctly, that Saeed Nursey has impacted the world, either in his time or in our time.
Yeah, I think that he impacted greatly. First of all, in Turkey, he was in Turkey. Of course, he was in the late Ottoman Empire. He advocated for nonviolence, and that's why it could be really some revolts against the modern state, but he eliminated those type of possible violence that will really cause bloodshed. And I think in the world, he contributed to interfaith connections, interfaith dialogue, interfaith relations. His philosophy of coming together and sharing the same humanity is very influential even today. I think there are many people who are following his teaching and making events and coming together and then contributing to a certain extent to the betterment of humanity.
Thank you. Herb, you're muted. How about Rami Shapiro?
In contrast to the other individuals being spoken about tonight, Rami Shapiro is still making a contribution. He's still alive. That's not a question of quality, but just that it's an ongoing process. I think that two things that he's done. First is that because he is alive at a time where our technology is changing, he is reaching people in ways that the other speakers and the persons that they spoke of weren't able to. The notion of a weekly podcast that somebody can listen to it wherever they go is a tool that the other wonderful leaders didn't have at their disposal. Specifically, I think I know that people think of Judaism as unchanging, but I know that it wouldn't still be around 5,000 years later if it hadn't made enormous changes. Things like places to pray rather than places to sacrifice. What Rabbi is doing is saying, we're changing again. We are living in a society uncontemplatable by our sages, a multicultural society, a society that's democratic, or at least hopefully remains so. The ability to cross boundaries and to allow Judaism to continue to morph by bringing in the best of faith is what Rabbi Romney's contribution is.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Hermansen for Muhammad Iqbal.
Yeah, where I would like to go with this, and it could, as you said, it could take 4 hours. I'll try to be short. I think all of our figures living in modernity, and especially, let's say our 2 Islamic figures that I'll mention, you have a question of religious movements and you have a question of political movements. And both Iqbal and Nursi lived in highly politicized times in terms of religious identity. So Nursi, as Zeki mentioned, but really didn't maybe underline it, Nursi was persecuted. He spent a lot of time in jail because the kind of militant secularism of the Turkish public found Nursi's religiosity threatening. Iqbal, and this, Iqbal died before the creation of Pakistan, but you do have the idea of a religious nationalism and what kind of religious nationalism, which, by the way, could get into an interesting discussion about Israel, because both Israel and Pakistan are founded about the same time as a homeland for a religious community. So in terms of Iqbal, you know, what would Iqbal have thought about the way his legacy played out? Iqbal, unlike the other 3 figures, what was not himself somebody who had disciples, right? So he inspired people in many ways, including religiously, but he was not a murshid. He wasn't training people in that way to be part of a religious movement. And if I can just, I know I don't want to go on too long, but say something about Sufism. Both Nursi and Iqbal could be seen as critics of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, like institutionalized Islamic mysticism of their times. So they're steeped in that heritage, they're drawing on that heritage, they're critiquing that heritage and suggesting that it could go in new directions. And Nursi actually inspires religious movements that continue until today. I think the legacy of Iqbal is somewhat, you know, that wasn't his project to be a Sufi teacher. He inspires a number of intellectual strands that get associated with different political and religious movements. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So Steve Brody has a question for a couple of you that I'm reading. For Rabbi Lee, he said, I've heard from a relative of Lubavitcher that only via Orthodox Judaism will Judaism survive in the future, that the other branches of Judaism will die out through assimilation and loss of religious practice. And by the way, I hear that all the time, not from everybody, but from some Jews. The question is, what do you think Lubavitcher Rebbe would say to that opinion?
So first of all, I will say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was in no way a pluralist. I think that's very clear. He was not a pluralist at all. At the same time, the terms of this statement are very alien to the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe talked and the way that he encouraged his followers to talk. First of all, this is a demographic observation, okay, based on how many children Orthodox people have versus how many children non-Orthodox people have, rates of assimilation, I guess here probably calculated by intermarriage and so forth. And this was of absolutely no interest to Lubavitcher Rebbe. Lubavitcher Rebbe spoke almost not at all negatively or positively about the other denominations of Judaism. And indeed, he was very cautious about talking about other people's spiritual levels. For example, the common language used in the Orthodox world for outreach work is called kiruv, bringing someone close. somebody used that expression with him. Actually, the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, used that language with him. And he said, who are you to say that somebody is far away and you're close? Meaning to say, because someone is non-observant doesn't mean they're further away than you are. It just means that they're in a different spiritual place than you are. So having said that, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's worldview was completely different. He had absolute faith in the ability of mitzvot, of Jewish practice to transform people, and that was his absolute focus. His focus was, how do I introduce more individuals to Jewish life? He was absolutely disinterested in all of these predictions. So while I know people do kind of say these things, this really kind of doesn't jibe well with the way the Rebbe saw the world.
And I ask you to clarify what you just said in the following way. So the first thing you said is he was not a pluralist.
Correct.
But you also said that he took umbrage at this bringing someone close. Who are you to say their way is further than yours? How do you reconcile those two views, being not a pluralist, but also having that other attitude?
Meaning he felt that there was an authentic Jewish tradition, authentic process of Jewish law that determined what was normative Jewish practice and what is not normative Jewish practice. So he would have seen the conservative movements, reform movements, as engaged in non-normative Jewish practice, not as kind of variations on a theme.
Okay, I mean, you can see that how people can find those two statements not fully consistent and how others could find them very consistent, and I'll leave it at that. So the next question from Steve Brody is for Professor Saritaprok. Given how committed Nursi was to nonviolence, do you know how he reacted to what the Nazis were doing to Jews and other minorities in the 1930s and 40s? And in particular, did he maintain a belief that nonviolent approaches still needed to be followed in trying to stop Hitler? And I'll make a digression. I'm going to give you low culture. I gave you the Raiders already. There was the award-winning Star Trek episode called City on the Edge of Forever, where this woman was responsible for the Nazis winning World War II because she founded a nonviolence movement in America in 1932. So Star Trek is all over this. Anyway, what do you think, my friend?
I think what Nursi suggests is he's in Turkey, of course, and generally, when you look at his overall writings, nonviolence inside of the country, that the country will be safe, will be in order, will not have anarchy, will not have violence that will be violating the situation of innocence. But when there is an aggression from outside, Nursi says there is a valid place for force. So that is, for example, sometimes I say to my students when we discuss this nonviolence concept, God forbid, if China attacks the United States, are we say nonviolence? That definitely we will need to defend ourselves. So defense is okay, I think, in Nursi's teaching. And actually, you have to be powerful to defend against any possible aggression. But that's totally an Islamic understanding of the concept of war. War should not be initiated, but when it starts, you have to defend. And even in the time of war, it says, Nursi's teaching is very compatible with the Islamic understanding. If the other side inclines to peace, you should make peace. Peace is better, like a principle in the Qur'an. Peace is better. But if there is no way, and the other side is aggressively attacking you and killing you, then you have right to defend yourself, and then violence is allowed. So there is just war, the concept of just war in the Islamic teaching as well.
Okay, thank you. So I could keep going with
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
He's not so pacifist in all
Okay,
aspects.
got it. So I can keep going with the questions in the chat, but let's hear some new voices. So let's go with people with their hands up. First, Abdul, then Ibrahim. Abdul, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
I had a question for Dr. Hermansen. And we Muslims from the Indian subcontinent, including India, Pakistan, even Bangladesh, we get the opportunity to attend a lot of presentation, events, and speeches related to Muhammad Iqbal. And we hear about all his Urdu writings and Persian writings, including Asrar al-Khudi that you just mentioned, The Secrets of the Self. But we hardly ever hear about the book, Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And this is probably the first time I've heard about it talked in some detail. Is there a particular reason why this is so?
I'll try to give a very quick answer. Well, the other writings of Iqbal are in poetry. And of course, poetry is, moving and engaging and certainly so beloved, as you mentioned, in the cultures of the subcontinent, that may be more relatable to people. Reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is a very sophisticated and eloquent, brilliant a book, the gist of which is that there's a principle of movement and creativity with, embedded in the Islamic tradition from the beginning, both in the model of the Prophet Muhammad and in the teachings of the Qur'an itself. And if things have become kind of stultified and log jammed, we have to find the keys to unlock them and move forward so that we can remain faithful in the modern world. So I'm sure our Jewish, traveling companions in the dialogue will recognize some of those debates within their own tradition. So Iqbal was speaking to that as somebody who was a master of the intellectual tradition and the kind of philosophical implications of what it means to revision religious structure. So it's a sophisticated book, and perhaps it's still engaging people now outside of the subcontinent. So maybe they're not just two Iqbal, many Iqbals, which makes him a very complex figure to try and present.
Thank you. This is all reminding me of our ancient leaders and how betwixt and between they must have felt in their own time in order to become a leader, because we keep hearing about these people who are bridging different divides. The modern leaders. Well, if the modern leaders were all, bridging divides, maybe our ancient leaders were as well. So I want to turn this over to Ibrahim for a moment. Ibrahim, I feel a little piggish plugging the Klal Yisrael and Ummah discussion for JIDS. So I want to give you an opportunity, in addition to asking your question or making your comment, if now or later you want to plug a Rumi Forum event, please do.
Thank you. I'll just drop a link towards the end of the conversation for the upcoming Interfaith Leadership Forum, where Rumi Forum is one of the organizing partners. Just as a note about the question regarding the question about Nursi's response to World War II atrocities, in one remark in his Risale Nur, he has called the victims of World War II as martyrs by victimization. So he called them martyrs, although a vast majority were not Muslims. And after World War II, he openly supported the formation of NATO and Turkey being part of it. So it clarifies his position with regard to such atrocities threatening the humanity again.
And maybe one thing I like to add, Rabbi Weissman shared something with us. Please take note of that. It's a Nursi nonviolent approach to Armenian and Greek minorities. There is a link there. And also for Sabiha, I'm going to send you Nursi's chapter on the stories of the prophets and their implication to the modern technologies. Thank you.
So why don't we go with a question now in the chat from Sarfraz Mian to Professor Hermansen. Can you talk about Iqbal as a social reformer with respect to his work on Shikwa, Jawab, Shikwa? I am sure I did not pronounce that well, but I hope that's
okay.
Clear.
Thank you very much for this very rich question. Apologize, I'll have to take it on rather quickly. So this was two famous poems, but think sort of long poems, almost like little books written by Iqbal. Shikwa means complaint. So the first he wrote the complaint, which is in the voice of the Muslim complaining to God, you know, we worshiped you so faithfully, we, you know, can I say, conquered the world in your name, et cetera, but now in the modern age, we have fallen into decline. You know, why? This is not fair. And actually Iqbal got a lot of criticism for writing this, that, you know, you would complain against God. So that was sort of part of the ethos, you know, the part of this kind of breaking out of the mold and facing things as they were. So then he responded in the answer to the complaint, even more boldly, he takes the divine voice and answers the question. Where I want to go very quickly is to mention there's a well-known verse of the Qur'an that's invoked a lot in modernity, the gist of which is, indeed, God will not change the condition of a people and a nation, a people, until they change what is in themselves. Now, this can be read in multiple ways. And I would say that in Iqbal's answer, he's taking the position of a modernist, which is you change yourselves by kind of pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps. You know, promote education, you become more dignified, you kind of clean up your act, and you are social reformers. So it's a call to social reform in kind of a modernist mode. But we could also have responses to that remind me at least a little bit of Rabbi Schneerson, kind of saying, you know, do the mitzvot, you know, be more pious. You change what is in yourself by doing inner work and Torah study, and, you know, and of course there can be multiple perspectives on that change, which are not mutually incompatible. But I would say, Iqbal, that, you know, as a social reformer, it's like we'll do social, you know, we've got to be better, and that's part of the divine plan. That's the divine answer. That's
Thank you.
To that question.
Thank you. Victoria Martino, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Oh, thank you. I think Sabiha was before me. Unless, oh, no? Okay.
Well, but she's spoken already, and we're going to get back to her, but we want to hear you for the first time.
Oh, well, thank you very much. This is fascinating, and I think a life's work. I've always been very interested in interreligious dialogue, and this has been very rich and way over my head, but I look forward to studying more. My question has to do with interreligious dialogue. It's primarily, I would say, a question for Professor Sari Toprak. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right. In terms of, I know you wrote a book called Islam's Jesus, and I'm curious in the interreligious dialogue, because so many people sort of off the cuff say, oh, well, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam can all have fruitful dialogue because they're all Abrahamic religions. They have the same source, et cetera. They all originate in the Middle East. And but I'm wondering in terms of if you feel that at the end of the day, it's better to emphasize the actual values of the religions and sort of move away from theology and more towards the action of people who are practicing those beliefs, simply for the reason that I've wondered how to get around the fact that Christians are, the Muslims and Jews will recognize the teachings of Jesus, but not his claims. And so it becomes kind of a thorn in terms of the interreligious dialogue. So I just wondered if you could speak a bit to that question. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think, of course, there are points of differences. And I think in my book, I mentioned, I think I have 2 chapters on how interfaith dialogue will contribute to the world peace. Christians, Jews, and Muslims, if they come together, they contribute more than half of humanity. They constitute more than half of humanity. And my argument in that book is that they can make peace in the world if they come together. Instead of focusing on the points that differ, they focus on the agreements, the things that they agree on. It doesn't mean that to deny their differences. Of course, they have differences, and it is normal, and it is actually richness to accept people as they are. Not, I like you if you are like me. No, I like you as you are. That is the point, actually, and accept people as they are. And they have like a great umbrella, and that is what we call the Abrahamic tradition. All of them have a great respect for Abraham, and they believe in the same God, the creator of heavens and earth. So they have very common ground, and more maybe social issues like anti-drug activities, something, anti-poverty, to make organizations that are working together to bring betterment for humanity and to fight against some diseases or social diseases of our society. These are all acceptable in the Islamic teaching. And I think Muslims, Christians, Jews, they can come together. So that's my argument in the book. And then when I interpret the coming of Jesus, I found fascinating aspects of scholars like Nursi, Saeed Nursey, and Muhammad Iqbal. Saeed Nursey says dialogue is the goal of that. Dialogue that will bring peace. Because the hadith, the saying of the Prophet says, Jesus will come as a just, the one who will bring in justice, the one who will bring peace. And Muhammad Iqbal says the essence of the message of Jesus is love, peace, and mercy. If you are working for these things, Jesus is there. Don't wait for a person coming from sky. And that's very fascinating. So I think that's why if we can come together and work for all these things, eventually we'll be at least to a certain extent contributing to the betterment of humanity. And that's our, it is not, maybe we are not successful, but if you are on that way and you work for that, I think you are on the right path.
I can speak on behalf of both the JIDS folks and the Rumi Forum folks that it's nice to hear someone speak so well of dialogue at a time when some people think of it as a dirty word. They think that it should be opposed to action, or mental masturbation is another word for it, some people might think. And it's beautiful to hear that is not a universal sentiment, certainly not at the Rumi Forum and JIDS. So Sabia, you're next, you're on deck. You're on deck. You're not up yet, but you're next. So we want to hear from another voice that we haven't heard from. Mary has a question, and this is a scary question because it's another one of these questions that could give rise to 20-hour answers. So I haven't figured out a way how to cabin you guys yet, but she wants to hear from each of you. as to what your thinker thinks about selfhood or, personal identity, individual identity, ipsity. So can you very, very succinctly opine on what your thinker, how your thinker would view those concepts? And I guess we should start as we did with Professor Hermansen. We're going to go back to that order.
Okay, so
Folks. So in the case of Iqbal, of course, a major element of his thought is his unique, kind of presentation of a new idea of selfhood or hudi, personhood, almost an existential making yourself. But perhaps I'd like to go to something else in his work that comes out of the Sufi tradition, and he emphasizes. There's a long-standing discussion in Islamic mysticism about the prophetic role, or the prophet and the saint. And it's echoed in many other mystical traditions. It has to do with activism. The two terms are fana. Fana is like the annihilation of the self, the dissolution of the self, the drop going back in the ocean. And Muslim thinker Iqbal and Muslim Sufi thinkers before him have taken the experience of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and said, well, the Prophet the Prophet went to the highest level and experienced annihilation in the divine, and then came back to the world. So the kind of activist role, that's called baqa, or subsistence. So maybe be in the world, but not of it, or bring back that level of realization that is part of your destiny, because it is part of the divine plan that you are here and you are manifesting that selfhood. So it's not an egotistical selfhood, but it's also not an effacement. It's, bringing that realization into life. So I hope that somewhat answers at least part of the question.
Thank you. That was great. Herb, how does this pantheist view selfhood?
That selfhood is an illusion. That it is at best an instant of illusion. That there are two images that Rabbi Romney uses a lot, and that is the wave in the ocean. That for a short time we're the wave, but we've always been the ocean. Another image he uses is a knot on a rope. Sometimes the knot exists, knot comes undone. The knot has never been anything but part of the rope. And when the knot disappears, it's once again the rope. So the notion that we somehow are bounded and are eternal, we are, because we're part of God. We are an infinitesimally small and temporarily tiny part of God, but we've always been. Let me stop there.
For those not familiar with pantheism or panentheism, which is that the world is in God, you could call it a relative of pantheism, you'd be surprised how many people debate in that world this very question. It's a pregnant question. Professor Sarudaprak, you next.
Yes, just very briefly. Human beings, every human being in the teaching of Nursi is like a universe. Every human being. He says, if you enlarge a human being, he will become a universe, or she will become a universe. If you squeeze the universe, it will become a human being. So such precious a creature, and the adequacy of God and the art of God. Human being is the most precious art of God. And therefore, he has a duty before God and before humanity. And therefore, the purpose is that to fulfill that duty, to worship God and to gain eternity. He is here temporarily. It is not a full place. This is not like an eternal place. He will be eternal eventually, and he will be reflecting the divine manifestation of the divine names on earth and in heaven.
Thank you. Rabbi Lee.
Okay, not an easy question to answer. This is the Chabad, the Chabad Hasidic philosophy that the Rebbe espoused and taught and expanded has a very kind of complex way of understanding what a human being is. But basically, a human being is a creature at war, meaning to say that that we have two souls. We have an animal soul, which kind of is our instinctual self, and we have a divine soul, which, as I put in the chat, there is using the language, using a language from traditional Jewish texts, chelek Elokai ma'al mamash, an actual piece of God from above, meaning to say that a person has a divine essence. That divine essence is completely nullified to God. And in fact, everything in the world has a non-existent kind of existence. So on the one hand, you are a creature, we're a creature at war. We're kind of physical, spiritual beings at war. On another level, we are a piece of God, and therefore have an incredible dignity as in that sense. And then lastly, even as a piece of God, we're also nullified in relation to God, meaning that we have no existence. So we're simultaneously the most exalted thing in the world and non-existent. I'm sure
that's a very ancient Jewish concept, very ancient Jewish view. Sabiha, you have a story for us. And this may be the last word tonight until we hear from our four presenters to wrap it up. You're mute. Okay, you're good.
I just wanted to share, listening to Professor Hermansen, how Iqbal has inspired me, or has been inspiring me since I was in high school. We grew up in Pakistan studying Iqbal's poetry. And the theme that we were taught in his poetry was Khudi, as the professor mentioned, which we understood was self-respect. And Iqbal motivating the Muslims of the subcontinent who were dejected and demoralized and frustrated and felt that there was no hope for them, he inspired them to feel that they had something good in themselves. They were better than what they thought they were. They had potential. They had possibilities. All they had to do was strive to achieve their potential by developing and enhancing their spirituality, developing their intellect, or whatever gifts God has given them. He asked people, you can do it. You can do it. You have it in you. You have God's gift bestowed on you. You are blessed with a lot of talent. You can do it. And the whole idea and premise behind this, what we were taught, was that he had the vision of a homeland for the Muslims in the subcontinent. And he knew that for them to achieve that dream, they had to feel that they had to feel confident in their ability to pull themselves up. And it was that idea that enabled him, or that motivated Iqbal, inspired Iqbal to try and push this concept through his poetry. And poetry was the form through which he touched the hearts of the people, of the Muslims in the subcontinent. And what he had to say not only inspired me as a young girl. I mean, I was living in Pakistan, the dream had been achieved, but we had a long way to go. And that reading his poetry would give us the confidence that, yes, we can do it. We have it in us. And it's relevant to this day. Anytime Muslims are feeling, I'm down in a rut, read Iqbal. And then you'll feel better about yourself and you'll pull yourselves up. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Well, I think we've heard some really fascinating presentations tonight. I will leave it before they finish for you all to think about what they've taught us about the impact and the role of these thinkers. So you often hear in Judaism the Jewish civilization compared to a tree. And, we think about branches. The different branches could be literally branches on the tree. But I guess I'm thinking about the ancient times and modernity and whether these thinkers that we're hearing about now, are they merely growing the branches on the tree of Judaism and the tree of Islam? Or are they really impacting the roots? Are they really impacting the trunk? I won't answer that question, and I won't even ask the speakers to answer those questions, but I will throw it out for you all to think about. And then maybe take a couple of minutes each tops for each of you to give closing statements about whatever you want to talk about. Dr. Saridaprak, if you want to talk about the Las Vegas Raiders, you can, but we're gonna whatever you want to talk about. But let's start again, reverse order with Rabbi. Rabbi Lee, you go first.
You fooled me. Reverse order. I guess what I would say is, first of all, I love the opportunity to kind of to see the kind of scope of Muslim and Jewish spiritual leadership in a kind of in modern times, I guess. And I think in all of these cases, I think we should think about what it means to be a bridge between tradition and modernity. My background is a little bit in history of religions, anthropology, and I guess I think in that direction. But what does it mean to take traditional knowledge and to be applying it to a very modern world? And in each of these cases, we see different takes on that. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of the dialogue, is to be able to see those different takes and how those different takes speak to each other. So if we're going to send anybody away with anything, I would send you away with it, that this conversation should continue in your head long after we leave Zoom. And that is to kind of allow it to percolate and to kind of allow these thinkers and to allow what's been said here to speak to each other in ways that couldn't happen in Zoom, but maybe can happen in your head. And hopefully the conversations will continue between us over time and in different contexts.
Thank you. Professor Saridaprak.
I was sending a message to someone. Could you please repeat the question? What is the question?
Yes, you have 2 minutes to talk about whatever you want to talk about. How's that? Or do you need rules?
I remember you said like the roots and the branches. I said, is there any question about that?
No, okay, you want to answer that question? You can answer it. Do you think that modern thinkers affect the roots and the trunk of Islam, say, or do they just help grow certain branches? That's the question. If you want to answer that, or you want to talk about something else?
I would say both. They got their source, especially Nursi. He gets his reference from the roots, and then he's improving the branches and making larger and larger. The branches should be larger and larger until it becomes fully fruitful. So my point is that dialogue, cooperation, alliance is necessary for the future of humanity. And I think I appreciate what you have done. I appreciate Rumi Forum's activities, your activities. And I think this should continue. Eventually, we have a verse in the Holy Qur'an. It says, we have created you from male and female and made you into tribes and nations so that you know each other. So through this dialogue, through this cooperation, these understandings, people will know each other. And then eventually they will cooperate. And then that is what I feel, that eventually they will be able to make peace in the world, will contribute to the peace in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Herb?
If Rabbi Romney were here, he might use the analogy of the three blind men and the elephant. One being certain the elephant was a trunk, the other that the elephant was a leg, and the final that the elephant was a tail, and none of the blind men would see the entire elephant. The entire elephant is the one that is all things, that exists at all levels, that exists at the level of dimensions that we depend upon but cannot even perceive. What I would implore, what Rabbi Romney might implore us to do, is to step outside of our boxes and see each other.
Okay, thank you. Professor Hermansen, we made you go first, so now we're giving you the privilege of getting to go last.
Okay, well, that's a heavy burden. So I'm thinking of the metaphor of the tree, and I'm thinking, well, if you're coming along in modernity, I really don't think that, we could be expected to change the trunk. So I think the tree is maybe the wrong image, or maybe it's one image and there can be many images. I don't want to say anything's wrong, but I'm thinking of the story of the walnut, right? So we're thinking of tradition as a walnut, or the essence of religion as a walnut. So what's the walnut about? Is it about the shell? Is it about our identity and the rules and holding on? Or is it about what is inside, as some of the Sufis say, not only the meat of the nut, but the nut is pressed down to that oil or that essence. So I think that the aspiration of all of these great teachers that we've been learning about is to get to that essence or the oil. And of course, in the case of the nut, people say in modernity, what do you do? What's the purpose of this nut? I mean, is it to firm up the shell, kind of like the Freudian ego, like you don't want to crack in modernity, things are too rough, so you better strengthen that ego? Or is the purpose to plant that nut so it can flower and flourish, and God knows better, and that's the end.
Thank you all so much. And by all this time, I'm referring to all of you who are still here. And wow, it's been a very fascinating session. And I will admit that Spinoza changed my trunk, but not the roots. I think the roots were given before him. So take care, everyone. And I hope that we will see you at future JIDS and Rumi Forum events. Good night. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Ibrahim. And thank you all speakers. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.